now because we are also running a little bit behind schedule. I think that we are now ready to start with our next panel. Obviously, we've heard that energy efficiency is key not only for companies in order to be able to cut on their costs, but also because it leads to a reduction in the carbon footprint. Over the following 50 minutes before the lunch break, we will be covering in detail the regional landscape for climate finance and carbon taxation. How is the incentive system for climate resilient and low carbon investments? Are investment funds steered towards renewable energy projects? Can carbon taxation support us reduce emissions at the level required? I think that these are just a few of the questions that will be addressed by Dr. Nasser Saidi, the chairman of the Clean Energy Business Council and president of Nasser Saidi and Associates, whom I would also like to welcome to the stage. Joining Dr. Nasser Saidi in this discussion, we have David Ramos, Senior Manager of Sustainability for Hsbc Bank MENA. David, please join us. Let's give him a round of applause. We also have Alex Roussos, partner at Dentons. A round of applause for Alex as well, please. And lastly, Peter Smith, Managing Director, Head of Strategy, Policy and Risk at Dubai Financial Services Authority. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dr. Saidi.
Thank you for joining us at this session. This session is going to be focusing on climate finance. Another word for using it, of course, is sustainable finance. It's in fact become a buzzword today in the finance industry. We're going to try to cover a number of aspects having to do with climate finance. What's happening at the global level? The UN has launched a global fund trying to help lesser developed countries face the issues of climate risk. And let me just mention a couple of issues having to do with not having the infrastructure. If you don't have resilient infrastructure and you have a climate event, such as we've been having, winds, hurricanes, water, and all the rest, it can destroy whole towns, cities, and countries, as we saw recently in the Bahamas. Having resilient infrastructure requires more investment. Most of the underdeveloped countries don't have resilient infrastructure. That means things like power, water, transport, everything that sustains life could be affected. So you need to be able to provide the finance for that. So that was one of the things that the UN turned to. The US had committed under Obama. Trump withdrew that $2 billion commitment. Then you've got on the private sector side more investment coming into sustainable finance through what we call green bonds, green sukuk, or blue bonds, and the rest. And that is building up. We're privileged today, I'm going to get right into the panel. We're privileged today by having a regulator at the end. Regulators have an important role to play because they provide the framework for a lot of the financing. We have a lawyer who is involved in green bonds and sukuk and climate finance, and we have a banker. So we've completed the discussion. One thing that we are missing are the investors, and I hope some of you might be investors. So we'll come to you when we discuss the questions and answers. So I'm going to start quickly. I'm going to ask each of our panelists quickly to introduce themselves and what they're doing, okay? Starting from my left. And then I'll ask you some questions to get ourselves going. So if you just introduce yourself, what you're doing right now.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm part of the sustainability department of HSBC, one of the leading international banks and one of the leading international banks in the region as well. We have been working with HSBC around 4.5 years, and I'm also new to the region when I moved to HSBC. And in the sustainability department, we cover two angles of our sustainability work. One is the philanthropic arm of what we do as a big organization, and also what we can do as a commercial institution from a sustainable finance perspective. And we support our colleagues from both angles.
Thank you.
Very pleased to be here today to talk to you about green sukuk and green bonds. I'm Alex Roussos. I'm a debt capital markets partner at Dentons, based in the Dubai office. I cover our firm's capital markets business across the Middle East. I've been working for many years on conventional bond and sukuk transactions, and more recently we're starting to work on bonds and sukuk which focus on utilization of proceeds towards environmentally friendly or socially important projects. So be very pleased to cover some of the important topics and issues we've encountered today.
My name, as you have heard, is Peter Smith. I work at the Dubai Financial Services Authority in the DIFC just down the road from here. My role covers three aspects: strategy, policy and risk, all of which are relevant to the topic of climate finance and sustainable finance. From a strategy perspective, what do we as a regulator seek to encourage, seek to create, seek to facilitate in terms of the development of a sustainable finance market? From a policy perspective, what rules do we put in place? What expectations, what obligations do we put on the firms that we regulate, of which HBME is one example? And from a risk perspective, because we're a regulator, so we think about risks, what are the upside risks in climate finance, and what are the downside risks? What happens if the regulated community doesn't spend enough time and effort thinking about climate change and about climate finance and about the impacts on their businesses? So a lot of things to think about, and hopefully a lot of interesting things to talk about.
All right, thank you. Let's start off. I'm going to start off with Alex for a question. If we look at the green bond universe today, it's only about 500 billion. That sounds like a large number, but it's only 0.5% of the total global bond universe. So it's still very small, but growing. If we look closer to home in the region, in the UAE in particular, we've had two green bonds, one by NBAD, which a green bond issued in March, and then more recently, MAF, Majid Al Futtaim, has issued the first green sukuk. So, question, I mean, what sort of challenges are facing the regional issuers? Is it, if they want to issue a bond or a sukuk, is it their own preparation? Is it a question of documentation and legal issues or regulatory issues? What is it that are the main barriers for them to move ahead? Because we've seen governments being active, but what we really need are corporates, because they're the people who are making the difference in terms of climate finance.
Indeed, thank you. It's very true that capital markets are a potentially very important source of funding for environmentally friendly projects. It is indeed true that it is a very novel and nascent area of capital markets globally, and even more new for our region here. There's been a lot of positive talk, a lot of positive rhetoric about potentially issuers tapping green capital markets, social capital markets in the region. And now we're seeing the first transactions come through. As you mentioned, NBAD did the first green bond in 2017. They were followed by Majid Al Futtaim. They've issued two green sukuk this year, almost back to back. One was in May, the other one was last month. So Majid Al Futtaim have issued green sukuk worth $1.2 billion, quite a significant size. The Islamic Development Bank as well is marketing at the moment, have announced potential issuance of a sustainable sukuk. Sustainable, just to differentiate between green, social, and sustainable. Green is obviously where use of proceeds are used exclusively to finance or refinance new or existing projects that have a positive environmental impact. Social bonds are where the proceeds are used towards projects that have a positive social impact. And sustainable sukuk or bonds are where the proceeds are used for a mix of green and social projects. So the Islamic Development Bank have come out, they're marketing a potential sustainable sukuk. These are all very positive developments. We know that there are other issuers in the pipeline that are looking to issue sukuk or bonds to finance environmental projects. In terms of what could prevent an issuer from tapping capital markets, it's worth pointing out that the issuers that we have seen in the Middle East are seasoned conventional bond or sukuk issuers. So this wasn't their debut issuance. They've issued many bonds and sukuk in the past, and now they've decided to switch to green. So they're entities that are very familiar with capital markets, and the transition to green for them is quite easy. But when looking to do a green bond or a green sukuk, the potential major obstacle for an issuer is cost and the additional work that is required, which I don't believe is prohibitive. We haven't come across an issuer that's balked at the cost or additional work required to bring a transaction to the market. The first thing an issuer needs to do is that they obviously engage an investment bank who will structure the transaction, and they engage an independent service provider that will help them put together a framework, a green finance framework. Majid Al Futtaim did that, Islamic Development Bank did that, FAB as well. The framework typically, what it does is that it points out the internal policies that are in place, that an issuer has put in place as part of its overall corporate governance, aimed at achieving sustainable development of the company in the future. And it also aligns its framework to the 4 key principles that have been published by the International Capital Markets Association, now ICMA as we call it in our industry. They've come out with a set of principles in order to give the market a certain level of transparency and consistency across the board, and it's actually quite positive to note that a lot of issuers globally, not just in the region, are following ICMA principles when they issue their green bonds or green sukuk in the market. ICMA focuses on 4 main principles. One is the use of proceeds. So an issuer needs to identify a number of generic eligible categories where the proceeds of the issuance need to be utilized. The second principle relates to the process of evaluation and selection. So how does an issuer select a specific project and place that project in the eligible categories that it has identified? Then management of proceeds. So again, this goes to the whole overall credibility of the system. How does the issuer segregate the issue proceeds that it receives from investors and allocate them towards specific projects? Yes. And then how does an issuer, the final principle, how does an issuer report back to investors in terms of allocation of the proceeds and in terms of the impact that funding has actually achieved?
So the ICMA principle, I mean, you're pointing to 2 important things. One is you have to be prepared yourself in terms internally. Are you following ESG principles? Are you reporting on sustainability? What sort of controls do you have internally? That's one aspect. But the ICMA principles are important. You pointed to them. But one question remains, who monitors that? Okay, you've issued a bond, a green bond or a green sukuk. Who actually monitors that you're actually using the funds for the purpose that you said you were using? Because there's also accusations now of what we've called greenwashing, right? That you take funds that were intended for a green purpose, you pass them through for certain things which are not so green and not so clean. So are we missing something in terms of monitoring, and who should be doing the monitoring?
Indeed, I think that's probably the problem at the moment. And yes, we know that it's a nascent area of capital markets, but the framework is voluntary essentially. So the guidelines or the principles that ICMA have published are voluntary. An issuer would be prudently advised to follow the principles if it wants its framework to be credible in the eyes of investors, especially green investors. But there's no independent entity that will monitor compliance with the principles. The issuer is, of course, obliged to publish reports, allocation and impact reports, and what Majid Al Futtaim have committed to is to publish annually an impact and allocation report that is made available to investors so that they can see what part of the proceeds, let's say what part of the $1.2 billion they've raised in a sustainably friendly manner have been allocated towards projects. Which projects have been identified. Majid Al Futtaim have identified 4 generic categories relating to renewable energy, energy efficiency, green buildings, and wastewater management. So they now need to identify specific projects into which the proceeds will go. That gives investors transparency,
Right.
and it gives the whole system credibility. And they need to also report on the impact of the investment. So what are the results? How much energy has been saved? How much renewable energy has been used? But the system is voluntary. There's no obligation. And actually, we go through significant pain to point out in the offering document to investors that if the company fails to allocate the proceeds, or if the projects fail to yield the required result in terms of positive environmental impact, that's not an event of default. The investors have no recourse to the issuer. They cannot ask for their money back. And they should note that there's no universal definition of what is green, and therefore Majid Al Futtaim's framework itself may not satisfy their own requirements and guidelines. So I think what we need to do, and then maybe we need to borrow here a little bit from the loan markets. They're a little bit, the loan markets are a little bit more advanced in the sense that we are seeing provisions in loan documentation whereby issuers are actually held accountable for not meeting specific ESG targets. I think we need to start seeing that in the DCM space, but the question again goes back to who's going to monitor it.
Who's going to be the monitoring body?
Exactly.
So I think that's a beautiful segue into regulators and their role. So Peter, I mean, earlier this year and before, led by the Bank of England and Banque de France, now World Bank and other IMF and all the rest are now focusing on greening the financial system. And there's now a network for greening it. Regulators are now talking about much more disclosure in terms of climate risks and how they affect the banking and financial sector. In our region, I think yourselves and the AGGM are members of that network. So can you tell us what you're doing for sustainable finance? And in particular, also get into the question we just got into. Do you have a role in monitoring?
I think if we start maybe at the global level in terms of what the regulatory community is doing, the answer is quite a lot. In banking, there is, as you mentioned, the network for the greening of the financial system, somewhere between 30 and 40 central banks and banking supervisors who are looking at 3 different areas, really. One is how supervisors should respond to the risks posed by climate change and by ESG issues in their work. The second, which will be of interest to yourself, NASA, certainly, is trying to come up with an analytical framework for the impact of climate change on the macroeconomy, which is obviously from a central banking perspective in most jurisdictions a key issue. And the third thing that's being looked at there is the mainstreaming of green finance and sustainable finance terminology and techniques. And I think this does lead us back to the point about the ICMA code and so on. In the insurance sector, the IAIS, which is the International Insurance Supervisors Grouping, has a sustainable finance initiative, sustainable insurance initiative, sorry. For those of you who are interested in impacts on the insurance industry, I would recommend the IAIS's paper on the impact of climate change on the insurance industry, which you can find on their website. It's a good read. In the securities sector, the Growth and Emerging Markets Committee of IOSCO, again the international securities body, has a working group on sustainable finance, and in particular sustainable finance and potential impacts on emerging and developing markets. The Islamic Financial Services Board had its annual conference this week in Jakarta, and the main theme of that was sustainable development. So the regulatory community pretty much everywhere is focusing on sustainable finance, on climate change and its impacts, and on ESG more broadly. I do think there is an issue around people focusing perhaps overly on the E of ESG. Nobody would deny the crucial importance of making changes in our environment and climate practices, not just for those of us in the room, but obviously for future generations and so on. But the S&G parts of ESG are pretty important as well. The social and governance aspects are pretty important. The disclosure issue is a really interesting one, and what sort of verification. There's a lot of thought in the regulatory community about what types of disclosure are needed in the ESG area. The traditional response is to require people to disclose certain things, and the expectation that the market will provide discipline around that. And if people are saying things that are not true, that the market will hold that issuer or that company to account. That's the traditional stance. The question in an area like the greenness of projects is whether the market is properly equipped to make that assessment. Now, it won't surprise you to hear me say that I don't think regulators are properly equipped to make an assessment of the greenness of projects and whether, for example, the proceeds of bond issues are going to appropriately green products. But it does beg the question, which I don't think we can answer yet, as to whether some independent third parties, some verification processes need to be built in. Well, one way of doing it is obviously through clauses in contracts and holding people to account. But you know, there are very strong views out there on how green things should be to be regarded as green, and I think this is an area where we'll see quite a lot of development over the next year.
But I think there's an important role in terms of disclosure, and now there's a task force in terms of disclosure.
Yeah, exactly.
So where are we in terms of all that you mentioned in the UAE and the GCC? How advanced are we, and what's the DIFC doing to become maybe a center for sustainable finance? Let me give you a little secret. When I founded the CBC, I was still at the DIFC. And the idea behind the CBC was for the DIFC to become the global center for clean energy. So where are we in terms of that?
Well, in terms of sort of tangible steps, I think as Alex has said, we're still at the very, very early stages of some of these developments. We issued green bond guidance in 2018, best practice guidance. I think most regulators are still at the stage of looking at encouragement and facilitation rather than hardwiring rules and obligations into the system, because I think the conversations about what sort of obligations are necessary in the system still has to evolve. I know you're well aware there is a working group within Dubai of a whole number of interested parties. The DIFC authority are involved in, and also HOCMA, the corporate governance arm in the DIFC, but a whole range of players, and I believe Hsbc are involved in that, if I'm not mistaken, David. But it's far broader than just financial services. It involves other players from across the Dubai economy, and that's a sort of bottom-up, market-driven initiative to try and create sustainable finance platforms and a sustainable finance conversation. We know what's going on in that group, but we're not actually directly a member of it. More broadly in the UAE, we are involved in some ongoing work with other UAE regulators in the area of sustainable finance, and I would just encourage you to look out for some further news on that in the near future.
David, let me turn to you. If you look at the global climate bond initiative, they're saying that if we're going to achieve these sustainable finance goals, we need to reach about $1 trillion worth of clean bonds, of green bonds. We're now around 500 billion or 550. So one question is, how do we get there? And the other question is, HSBC has a large footprint in this area. So what are you doing as HSBC, both globally but also in the region, to encourage green finance and green bonds in Sukuk? And how do you work with your clients in particular?
Absolutely. I'm afraid I won't be able to answer how do we get there. That's probably the golden question. Everybody would want to answer that one. What I can comment on is what HSBC is doing internally. And to be honest, since I joined only 4 years ago, well, HSBC probably has been always a quite important player in terms of sustainability and in sustainable finance as well. But over the last 2-3 years, that trend has evolved dramatically, and I see that in my daily work reflected. We launched in 2017 a new sustainability strategy, a global sustainability strategy that included 5 commitments very closely related to sustainable finance. We committed to kind of promote or facilitate 100 billion investment in sustainable finance by 2025, of which we've done already 37 billion globally. And we are also meeting the targets in the region specifically. We also committed to be signatories of the RE100, so we are going to use 100% renewable energy by 2030 in our own
Infrastructure.
offices.
Infrastructure,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
We also committed to reduce the exposure on thermal coal, and that's why we changed our global policy on energy. And we limited very much where are we investing in thermal coal. And we also, you were mentioning the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We committed to report under those commitments. We did the first report
for HSBC
for
itself.
HSBC,
Right.
exactly, for all of our HSBC network. We reported under those recommendations last year, and that helped us identify 6 transition risk sectors, and now we are working with those clients that belong to those sectors on how we can help them transition and actually work towards that low carbon economy. And the last thing we did, we want to be seen as leading the discussions, leading thought leadership on these topics, and that's why we created the Center for Sustainable Finance, which is a global research institution. I issue a lot of reports around climate change and how the finance sector can support, and all the information is there. What we did internally, because those are commitments, it's very easy to just put them out there. So there has been a lot of work over the last 2 years specifically on making that a reality. We created those governance structures internally in the bank to make sure that we collaborate from the sustainability team, which are supposed to be the sustainability experts in the organization, but with the proper bankers, with the actual people that goes out there and talks to clients. We have delivered trainings at all levels in the organization. All the RMs have been, the frontline staff have gone through trainings around sustainability and sustainable finance. The top tier level as well, CEOs across the region and globally, they have gone through all those trainings as well. And what we manage is to actually, from a very small team that we are in this region, we are only 6 people in sustainability out of almost 10,000 people that work for HSBC in the Middle East. We managed to position ourselves as that key advisory department. So we work with the experts within the bank on each sector, in each category, and we just give them advice on sustainability and on what is the right way forward.
Okay, so that's very nice. You're greening HSBC. Now, what about greening your clients? Because you're in a region which is based on fossil fuels, right? Yeah. That's the main activity. That's the main thing. All the banks finance, either directly or indirectly, in the fossil fuel industry and related. So, 2 questions. What are you doing about greening your clients and making them abide with the objective of sustainable finance? And second, have you participated or are you participating in any green bonds in Sukuk?
Yeah. So on the client side, at the end, we are offering services to our clients.
I mean, I asked the questions because if there were some climate activists out there, they'd be jumping on the banks because the banks are being accused really of continuing to finance the fossil fuel industry at a time we want to divest from it.
So I don't come from the banking industry. I don't have a finance background. I'm a sustainability person. My background is fully sustainability since I started my career. So while I understand that this transition needs to happen, we also need, we need to take it step by step. It won't happen overnight. And that's what financial institutions can do. And that's why we are training everyone within HSBC to be able to have those conversations and help our clients and make them understand that we are there to help, but they need to transition. They need to start thinking on the future, because otherwise they will not have a business in maybe 15, 20 years' time, and we will not be able to help them at the time. So of course we are. I said it before. We are meeting our sustainable finance target for the region. So that means that we are having those conversations, and those conversations are being effective. But it is true that we can just offer what we are asked for to offer.
Sure.
So we need more push, probably from the regulators, to help us move the needle a bit faster, because we do need to act a bit faster than what we are doing. Mostly in terms of disclosure and transparency, and all of those things will help. I truly believe what you were saying earlier is that the market will act if we put the information out there. But,
Right.
yeah.
We'll come back to that in a minute, but let me turn a little bit, both yourself and Alex, what sort of market do we see for green bonds in Sukuk in the Middle East? We've had a couple of issues. Is it promising? Is this an area we should be looking at as a growth area for issuers and investors?
Absolutely. From our perspective, we see a lot of momentum behind green bonds and green sukuk. There are issuers in the pipeline that want to follow the example of Majid Al Futtaim and the Islamic Development Bank and FAB. More sort of positively, perhaps, more optimistically, what we're hearing from the international investor community is that ESG elements are actually a very important part of their overall credit analysis now of an issuer, because they look at an issuer, they look at a company like Majid Al Futtaim, for instance, and what they're saying is, if that company is not taking sustainable development seriously, that will impact its credit quality in the future. So this is, I think, a very positive development, because if investors are insisting on sustainability, the companies demonstrate that they've got a sustainable development policy internally, then I think that's going to force issuers to look at funding their projects via green sukuk or green bonds, because ultimately it will open up to them an additional pocket of liquidity. They'll have access to green investors, green funds, which are very significant, and that will drive their overall pricing downwards. So that there's a significant incentive on the part of the issuers now to look at doing green.
So the attractiveness really is that you've got some niche investors who are willing to come into this. So that's one of the incentives, I think, for...
Absolutely.
Are there any additional costs, though?
There are additional costs for an issuer, but I think those costs are dwarfed by the potential upside of pricing being driven downwards. And they're also dwarfed by we know that Majid Al Futtaim issued green primarily for profile, because they believe that this is very positive PR for their company as well. This is the reason why the Islamic Development Bank are doing it as well. So there's a significant upside on the sort of softer elements, which is the reputation of a company in the market.
Right. Question both to any of you, really. If I issue a Eurobond, I know what it is. It's an animal that is well described. I can take it off the shelf, and I know. We still don't have that for Sukuk, that's for sure, or for green bonds or green Sukuk. Should we be moving in terms of a common standard of defining what a green bond or a green Sukuk is? Can I start with you, Peter? Because, for an issuer, there seems to be a great deal of open ground as to how do I define it.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, looking at the potential for market development here, greater standardization brings significant benefits. We would prefer that to be market driven in terms of the evolution of a set of
Right.
standards. We see some parts of the world, perhaps the European Union will be first, where regulation on taxonomies and other aspects of the green conversation is likely. but I think we would certainly encourage the development of standards, both in the green bond area and in the Sukuk and green Sukuk area, where the need for standardization is really quite significant. I think there's a huge Islamic finance opportunity because of the capacity to link green issuances to particular real-world projects, and I think that's really attractive to a large number of potential investors from what we see. But the standardization aspect is, as Alex said, necessary to help with the market development.
So again, market development, David, perhaps what would really allow us to grow this market much faster than what we've seen? I mean, two issues are fine, but it doesn't really develop a market. What should we be doing?
I think it's coming naturally. As it was said before, probably this market is a little bit behind, especially on terms of the taxonomy. Of course, the EU is leading on that. When the taxonomy is released in the EU, probably we will just adopt that globally because they are the leading institution right now. But I think it's coming. We're just a couple of years, 2 to 5 years behind. What we saw recently, we just released the 2019 Sustainable Finance and Investing Survey from Hsbc. That's a global survey, but it has a specific chapter for the Middle East where we ask issuers and investors, around 150 from both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And the survey was very clear. 86% of them, and we're talking only regional investors, they plan to change from brown or less sustainable investments to green or more sustainable investments in the next 5 years. And in terms of the issuers, 94%, almost 94, almost all of them, they consider, or they had a very positive, they thought there was a very positive impact in having ESG-linked information around the loans and what is the issue. So it is happening.
Right. I mean, if we look at the rating agencies, the rating agencies are now regularly reporting ESG. Maybe more, as you said, more on the E and less on the S, maybe a bit more on the CG, on the corporate governance side. So the rating agencies are starting to do that, both at macro level in terms of countries and also in terms of issuers. Should they be doing more? I mean, is this an area that would be helpful in terms of a more important role for rating agencies? And also, could they eventually monitor the issuers?
I think it is very positive because it encourages disclosure and transparency. So if you have a clear label on how are you rated, it's very easy for the general public to understand. But there has been as well some issues on different rating agencies rating very different ways the same organizations. So I think there has to be an alignment as well on how those rating agencies are actually putting that label to make sure that we are driving the right companies forward and penalizing the ones that are not doing so well.
Right. Alex, you mentioned that there are niche investors. We know of sovereign wealth funds, Norway and others who are divesting away from fossil fuels and want to go increasingly, and have allocated something like 11 billion in case of Norway to green sustainable finance. What about appetite in the region itself here? Who would buy a MAF Sukuk or an NBAD bond?
We know that certain traditional investment houses are looking to invest in green, whether it's a bond or a sukuk. I was attending a conference in Saudi Arabia yesterday where a very prominent investor was on a panel, and they said, from the Middle East, and they said they will be investing because that's the mandate they have from their own individual clients. So I believe that body of potential investors will continue to grow in the Middle East. Obviously, when an issuer issues internationally from the Middle East, they go to Europe, they go to Asia. I think in terms of purely green investors, we'll probably see more of those coming from Europe and Asia rather than the Middle East, but I think the Middle East will also continue to grow. And I think that's the very important point about rating agencies, the role they can play. We're working with a potential sustainable bond issuer at the moment where they're discussing with rating agencies, and we can see that one of the big three rating agencies, the big three being S&P, Fitch, and Moody's, is trying to come onto the stage and they're trying to play the role of the service provider that provides the second party opinion on a framework. So I think rating agencies are taking this area very seriously, and they're trying to provide expertise, and they're trying to build their own team. So we've got all aspects of the market: issuers, investors, regulators, rating agencies, and hopefully potentially the auditing firms as well that are taking green finance more seriously. And I think we'll see significant development over the next couple of years.
What about the Islamic finance investment sector? Because green should be part of Islamic finance. It's part of those principles really for Islamic finance. Are you seeing appetite developing there? For any of it?
I think the appetite for green will develop across the conventional investor base as well as the Islamic investor base. Probably ESG sits more neatly with Islamic finance because Islamic finance ultimately is principle-based finance. But I think conventional bond investors are looking to invest in green very seriously to the same extent as Islamic finance investors. We have now the Islamic Development Bank, obviously, that's marketing a very significant, very sizable potential issuance. So we wait to see where the appetite will come from in respect of that instrument. But I think the sort of appetite will grow across conventional and Islamic. We need it to grow across conventional as well, because the Islamic investor community obviously is a lot smaller at the moment compared to the global conventional investor community.
Right. Now a slightly more technical question, maybe more to Peter. If we look at disclosure, eventually it's going to have to translate into accounting standards in some form or another. So will there be an IFRS eventually for climate-related risks, or is it cross-cutting? Is there beginning to be thinking about that?
I think it's, when you think about accounting, obviously you're starting off with the financial statements themselves, and not necessarily so much some of the other disclosures that appear in an annual report. And I think the accounting profession would want to retain that focus on the financial statements. So to the extent that the green or the ESG activities of any given company impact on the financial statements, they would already need to take account of that in terms of the work that they do. Again, we know that within the accounting community there are a lot of discussions going on around the disclosure point, but I don't think as of yet it would be translating into a hard standard, because I think that the linkage between, let's say, ESG disclosures and the actual financial statements, I think there's still too much of a separation between the two.
That's true.
In my view.
Yeah. David, to come back on this issue of how are you working with corporates in the region? We said you're greening yourself, but are you helping them green themselves?
We're trying.
Yeah.
We're definitely trying.
I mean, if a borrower comes to you,
Yeah.
Or an issuer, a potential issuer comes to you, do you immediately engage on sustainability,
Yeah.
or is this a secondary concern?
That's what we are trying to do, and that's why all the training and all of that capacity building internally is in place. What we are trying to do is that whenever there is a conversation happening between any company and HSBC, sustainability is being raised. I think it's happening. We do have internal records. We do have a tagging system in our internal kind of client relationship manager.
You have a credit scoring.
We have a tagging on that one where we can trace how many conversations are being handled or are being had around sustainability with our clients, and that's a target actually for our relationship managers to bring up sustainability. We are providing them with the tools that they need, guidelines, documents, to actually bring the conversation forward. And one thing that we are trying to do internally in HSBC, since we launched the strategy, is that we agree that DCM and green bonds, even if they are new instruments, they are quite already established in the market. So what we're trying to do is to look for other alternatives, so having other conversations with our clients than just telling them, let's issue a green bond or a sukuk. What we're trying to do is to find those opportunities around not only project finance, renewables. We are not very strong in project finance, for instance, in HSBC. Other banks are doing it much better than us, because we don't have the risk appetite for project finance and renewable projects because of the tenor. But we are trying to have those conversations with maybe smaller clients or even big ones, but with around things like retrofitting of their buildings, about sustainable buildings, certified sustainable buildings, it is LEED, BREEAM, all of those. Smart mobility, how can we help them in make that transition, also around smart cities. All of those topics are part of the daily conversation with our clients.
So you mentioned sustainable buildings and the like.
Yeah.
So if I'm sitting here and I say, can I come to you, HSBC, I want to install a solar panel either in my building or my house or a villa. Do you facilitate that? Is it easy to get a loan from you for those types of investments? Well, I mean, let's come down to reality and on the earth. I mean, the sort of things we care about, most people care about, is can I do it for my house, my villa, my building? How do I get everybody in the building to agree? Tenants, obligations, etc. So are you doing anything about that?
It is a great question, and thank you for the reminder, because I was forgetting to mention it. We are trying not to only cater for companies, for our commercial banking and global banking arm, but also for the retail banking. So we have a couple of products already. One of them has been there for a while. This is the green car loan. So whenever a client comes to us and wants to buy an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, they have access to lower cost in the financing for that vehicle.
How much lower?
50 basis points.
50 basis points. Out of how much, the total? I mean, what's the base?
I don't think I can go into specifics on the pricing, because probably will be specific to each client. Okay. But it's 50 basis point discount that is approved internally. Okay. And I think it was yesterday or the day before, we publicly finally announced that we have also a green mortgage for certified buildings. So there's also a discount both in the pricing of the mortgage itself, of the interest rate, and also on the processing fees for clients buying an apartment or a villa that is being certified as a community, or just one apartment within a building. What we try to do with that one is to drive the market forward, and that's why we chose only at the beginning, we are only accepting LEED certified buildings, and we're only accepting LEED Platinum and Gold, because we didn't want to accept any kind of standard. So those clients that come to us with those conditions, they will get as well a better pricing. In terms of the solar panels, still work in progress, so I'm not sure if I should be mentioning, but we are working with our team in a product that will also cater for that. Yeah, we're trying. We're getting there.
We have a little bit of time, maybe for some questions from the floor. Do we have a microphone somewhere? So if we can just have it more in terms of questions, and if you're addressing it over here, and if you're addressing it to somebody, just please say to whom you're addressing it, or whether it's to the panel, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasser. My name is Hsbc Al-Marashi, and I chair the Emirates Environmental Group. I have two questions. My first question is to Mr. David. I would like to be optimistic with you, really, to say that HSBC is doing. Can you give me, I'm still yet to find a solid example and case in the UAE that HSBC has come on board and supported any financial. You look at the buildings, they are the 65% or 70% of emitters of CO2 emissions. There's a lot of coal. There's a big need in the market from the developers, from the building owners to do retrofitting in their buildings. Yet, has HSBC come forward to say, yes, I can be that financial partner to ensure that I can finance retrofitting of buildings? I know this discussion has been going on for years now, for at least 3 years. But we are yet to see HSBC coming on board and committing to that. It's an international bank, it's not a national bank. So you do have a responsibility in whichever country that you are practicing. So if you are doing it in other countries, what is the hurdle that is stopping you from implementing it in the UAE or the region? That's my question, and I hope I get a good answer. My other question was for the green funds. Everybody knows the financial institutions are really holding the key to achieving sustainable development goals at the rate that it should be achieved. The UN Secretary General has just launched a global alliance for investors, calling for the financial centers and financial institutions, pension funds, and all of them to come into the fold and to ensure that together with other stakeholders, and it should not be just left on the government institutions to achieve the sustainable development goals. Yet, there's a very lukewarm response from that particular sector. And when you say that the green funds are not yet into the mainstream, is there enough awareness in the markets of this particular region to show about the importance, the value, the return on investment to every single lay person in the country to enable me to take the right decision to say, okay, I will invest in this instead of investing in that. I will buy these bonds instead of buying the normal convention bonds. What are you doing in that regard to raise the awareness of the normal
Investor
people?
awareness, yeah.
Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you very much. And of course, we welcome Habiba. She's the force behind all environmental change in the UAE. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you, Habiba, for always your questions spot on. It is true that probably, like any other financial institution, we do need to comply with our risk appetite and our risk appetite internally. And every single transaction that our RMs bring on board, it has to go through that panel of experts that evaluate if this is something that Hsbc can finance or not. This said, what I can remember at the top of my head, of course I cannot disclose names, but I can remember over the last 6 years to 6 months to 1 year, I can remember at least 3 cases of buildings, certified buildings that we've supported. Some of them were retrofitting of buildings across the region, not all of them in the UAE, but in Bahrain there was one case, in Kuwait there was another case, I think to remember. So this is happening, and what we managed to do internally with this work over the last 2 years that I was talking about is to enable communication channels for those frontline staff. Whenever they face a barrier with our risk team, then they can come to us and we can raise the conversation to another levels. So we have direct line of communication at CEO level. So whenever there is an opportunity that maybe initially, like the standard risk appetite does not allow, if it is sustainability related, we can escalate that topic. And not always, of course, it has to be based on each case specifically, but now we have the power to escalate that topic to the highest level within the organization, even at group level if it's not enough at the regional level. Group, I mean London, sorry, global level. And it has been some cases where something that initially was declined, it was approved because it is sustainable finance related. It is coming more and more. I won't say that we will, Hsbc and probably any financial institution will not decide on financing anything at any cost just for the fact of being sustainable. We also need to comply with our risk appetite internally. Hope that helps.
Alex?
Habiba, for the question. It's a very interesting question, actually. I mean, in terms of in knowledge amongst the investor community about green finance initiatives, obviously amongst the financial institutions, we're hearing it's not just HSBC, a lot of the banks have set up their own sustainable finance committees and teams, very significant on the advisory side. Whether they themselves are willing to invest in a green bond or a green sukuk and potentially take a lower coupon, I think that we will need to see certain sort of potential evaluation of other criteria when an investor looks to invest. There's obviously pricing discovery, and there's a lot of discussion around what an investor is willing to take, at what price, at what coupon is an investor willing to take a specific bond or sukuk. The question is, can we move to a stage where the investor is willing to take a lesser coupon in order to support an environmentally friendly project in the context of a green bond or a green sukuk? Can investors essentially leave some money on the table in order to ensure that these funds end up in the right projects via the issuers that come to the market. But I think in terms of awareness, this is growing, obviously still a very new area amongst institutional investors, which is where these bonds and Sukuk are placed with. There is significant knowledge. Industry bodies that set global standards, such as ICMA, play a very important role in enhancing that knowledge amongst investors. The question is whether that knowledge can cascade down to retail investors. And that's a very big discussion as to whether complex products like Sukuk should end up in the hands of retail investors. If we do go down that route, yes, I believe there is a lot to be done in terms of enhancing awareness amongst retail investors or high net worth individuals, for instance, and people who want to make a positive impact to the environment, whether they can invest through purchasing a bond or a Sukuk in environmentally friendly projects. I think that will be a significant development, but we're still a little bit away from that, because of regulatory concerns, because of disclosure concerns, because of the fact that issuers, a lot of the time, they don't want to expose themselves to liability to the wider public. They're more used to dealing with institutional investors.
Yeah, having said that, I think you're seeing the development of some instruments like ETFs, which are now going, you can get some green ETFs, which makes them available really to retail investors and could be very interesting.
Yep. Just on what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, really, mainly with the banks, actually. But we've seen a very significant change in the mindset of particularly the international banks and particularly the European banks. And I'm not just saying that because David is here, it's what we've seen. And that's in 2 dimensions. Firstly, the degree of challenge of brown projects and brown financing is huge compared to what it used to be. Brown financing for this part of the world, whether it be fossil fuel based, used to go through on a tick and a rubber stamp, and the degree of challenge and internal approval and internal scrutiny is now so much greater than it ever has been. And the flip side, the sort of why not when it comes to green financing, again, we see a lot of banks, and David's absolutely right, this does need to be seen in the context of an individual institution's risk appetite and need to run a business, frankly. But we've seen change on both sides of the coin, both the pushback against brown financing and the encouragement or a more open mindset towards green and sustainable financing. And we've seen that over the last 5-6 years. And some of the banks, compared to where they were 5 years ago, have made huge changes.
All right. Any other questions from the floor? One question, actually, which is related to carbon trading. Saudi Arabia has announced a carbon trading scheme. What's your view on that? How successful will it be? And a related question, what about carbon taxation? The carbon footprint of this region is the highest in the world by any measure. And if you make calculations of what you could raise through carbon taxes, you could raise multiple times what you're currently raising from VAT through a carbon tax, and much cheaper. So what's the view of our panel?
We used to be a carbon neutral bank back in 2012 because we were buying credits in the secondary market. And at some point, the decision was made of stop that, because we couldn't see enough transparency on the market, on the carbon market itself, to make sure that those credits were obtained in the right way.
The monitoring issue,
exactly,
once
the
more.
monitoring again. And that's why we decided to shift over time. It took a few years, but that's why we decided to shift into the RE 100, which is where we're actually doing the investment through PPAs or similar mechanisms, so we can actually prove and show evidence that the emissions, they come directly from our investment. I think that, and this is probably my personal opinion, not the bank's opinion, but I think that the carbon markets were a very good idea that wasn't executed properly. I do want to believe that they will come back stronger with time, but it probably needs that that push, I would say, needs that push from the regulatory environment to make sure that that the companies are being taxed and linked in with the carbon tax. That's happening so far in a very voluntary way. As long as there is not somebody that puts a price on that carbon and taxes companies for that, and hopefully use the proceeds of that taxation for
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, for an economist,
exactly.
pricing is the major issue.
Yeah.
And taxation is straightforward. I mean, it gives you all the incentives to perform. If I tax you $50 per ton, you feel it, and then you'll do something about it. But
however, sorry, just to comment, we have access to a model it was developed by the MIT, and that's a model that's going to be available. It's called Climate Interactive Model, and it's going to be available for free, but we have pre-access to it because we helped them develop the model. And in that model, it's a very simple web-based model that we were testing it recently. And carbon taxation will help, but it won't move the needle dramatically to address climate change. We need a whole range of
yes, sure.
things happening simultaneously. From probably efficiency that it was discussed before is the top one. As long as we are growing in energy demand, it doesn't matter how much taxation we put, because if you still need the energy, people will pay more to get the energy, but they won't shift.
But you become more efficient if I price it. Yeah.
Hopefully, but it will take time.
True.
On this topic, I need to make it clear this is my personal view, as David has as well, so not an official view. I mean, Dr. Saidi is obviously right. You know, a properly administered carbon price, however it's achieved, gives the entire economy appropriate information and signals. You can design either a carbon tax or a carbon trading system to work well. There are some problems with carbon trading schemes, and if you look at the EU, which is probably the best known example, for example, much of agriculture is excluded. Fewer than 50% of actual emissions are covered by the EU trading scheme. Any trading scheme like that with permits, there's always the potential for lobbying, which means that big polluters tend to lobby their way out of the scheme or out of the proper scheme. And then the question of whether the market will reach a sensible price for permits is of course another issue. A tax provides certainty on price, but not certainty on the level of emissions that result. So if the government sets the tax at the wrong level, you'd have the wrong incentives, as Dr. Saidi's already said. Personally, I think for this region, a carbon tax is better. It's simpler, it's easier and quicker to administer,
Cheaper, much cheaper
and to implement. You can have a policy up and running in a few months rather than a few years if you're trying to design a proper carbon trading scheme. It also provides a diversification of revenues, which in this part of the world is probably highly desirable as well. You face the usual challenges with any across-the-board tax about making sure that the lower socioeconomic groups are not impacted excessively and so on, but certainly particularly for the fossil fuel producing countries in the region, they should have the budgetary capacity to deal with that sort of issue. So to the extent countries do go down that route, I think the absence of lobbying to some extent and the simplicity of introduction, I think argues in favour of carbon taxation. But as I say, that's only a personal view.
Alex, any final thoughts on the issue?
On carbon tax or carbon
Or
trading?
carbon trading schemes or
Yeah,
carbon tax?
it's not something I've looked into personally. I think I defer to these two wonderful gentlemen on this issue. I mean, I think the only sort of point I would make is that it appears to me that at the moment most of these schemes are, again, voluntary. And when you have, it's the same problem we have actually in the capital market space at the moment with green finance. It's all voluntary, it's all self-regulated. So the question is when can we and where can we put pressure on issuers to actually use proceeds in an appropriate manner? Can we incorporate provisions in documentation, put options, events of default, covenants, etc.? So
I think, you know, the market development itself then gives incentives. I mean, if the market is very small, you don't get very excited as an issuer or a borrower to want to go into it. But as the market expands, it becomes more liquid, there are more issues, then people can get encouraged to go into that. So I think we're at the beginning of a market building exercise, but I think regulators, governments, international banks have an important role to play. So, I think we're fine. I'd like to please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent discussion. So, and I think we've now break for lunch. So we gave you some intellectual food, so now we can, I hope.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saidi. Thank you very much to our speakers as well. We are going to break now for a 45 minutes lunch, so quite short. However, I don't think that you can really go outside in this weather. And then just join us after the lunch break in order to kick off with a discussion led by Habib Al-Marashi. Thank you very much.